I used to think that trust was a solid, tangible thing, like the hardwood floors in the craftsman home I spent 3 years saving up to buy in the suburbs just outside of Austin. It was something you built board by board, nail by nail, until you had a structure strong enough to weather any storm. I thought Sarah and I had built that. We had been married for 4 years, together for 7, and our life together felt like the definition of the American dream we'd both spent our 20s chasing. She was a graphic designer with this infectious, bright energy that filled every room she walked into, and I was a project manager for a commercial construction firm, which meant long hours, early mornings, and a habit of trying to fix things before they completely fell apart. Then came Mark. Mark had been my best friend since our freshman year at Ohio State. We'd shared cramped dorm rooms, survived cheap beer, and navigated the terrifying transition into adulthood together. He was the kind of guy who could charm his way out of a speeding ticket or into a VIP section without trying, but underneath the charisma, he always seemed a little lost. When he called me 3 months ago, sounding completely broken after his tech startup collapsed and his long-term girlfriend kicked him out of their Seattle apartment, I didn't even hesitate.
I talked to Sarah, and we agreed he could crash on our living room couch for a few weeks until he got back on his feet, found a remote consulting gig, and secured his own place. I thought I was being a good friend, a stand-up guy, doing what anyone would do for a brother. I had no idea I was unlocking the front door and inviting the destruction of my entire life inside. The first few weeks actually felt like a nostalgic throwback. We'd crack open a few IPAs after I got home from the job site, grill burgers on the back patio, and watch college football on Saturdays, just like the old days. Sarah was incredibly welcoming, always making extra dinner or picking up his favorite coffee creamer from Trader Joe's. But as the days bled into weeks, the dynamic in the house began to shift in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on at the time. It was subtle, almost imperceptible unless you knew exactly what to look for. It started with the lingering glances, the way conversations would suddenly taper off the moment I walked into the kitchen, and the way Sarah started dressing just a little bit nicer, even on days when she was just working from her home office. I dismissed my initial uneasy feelings as jealousy or stress from work. I was managing a massive downtown high-rise project that was 3 weeks behind schedule, which meant my brain was constantly fried. I was leaving the house at 5 in the morning and not getting back until 7 or 8 at night, completely exhausted.
While I was stuck in traffic on the interstate or arguing with subcontractors, Sarah and Mark were spending their entire days together in the house. She worked from the dining room table, and he worked from the couch just 10 feet away. They shared lunches, walked our golden retriever down the shaded suburban streets, and built an entire ecosystem of inside jokes that I wasn't a part of. When I would finally sit down at the dinner table, I felt like a guest in my own home, trying to decode the references and laughter that tasked between my wife and my best friend. The breaking point began on a rainy Tuesday in early November. My superintendent called me at noon to tell me that a massive concrete pour had been delayed because of a supply chain issue, meaning my entire afternoon was suddenly wide open. For the first time in months, I had the chance to leave the site early, drive home, surprise Sarah, and maybe take her out to that upscale Italian place downtown she'd been dying to try. I remember feeling this sudden, overwhelming wave of relief as I pulled my truck out of the muddy construction lot. I was finally going to be present, to reclaim my spot in my own marriage, and to show Sarah that I hadn't forgotten how to be the husband she deserved. The drive home took 45 minutes, and the rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the taillights of the cars ahead of me on the highway. I listened to a podcast, humming along, feeling lighter than I had in a long time. When I finally turned down our quiet tree-lined street, I noticed Mark's rented sedan was parked in the driveway, crookedly blocking the left side. It was a minor annoyance, but it added to the strange, heavy sensation that suddenly settled in my chest as I parked on the curb. The house looked dark from the outside, the gray afternoon light casting long, somber shadows across the front porch. I unlocked the front door as quietly as I could, not wanting to startle Sarah if she was in the middle of a client call. The moment I stepped into the foyer, the silence of the house hit me like a physical wall. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was dense, heavy, and charged with an unnatural stillness. I set my muddy work boots on the mat and noticed Sarah's keys were on the counter, right next to a half-empty glass of white wine. That was unusual for 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon.
I walked softly across the hardwood hallway toward the kitchen to grab a bottle of water, my socks making no sound against the floor. As I approached the threshold of the kitchen, I heard a sound that made my breath catch instantly in my throat. It was a soft, muffled laugh, followed by the distinct rustle of clothing and a low, whispered protest that sounded like Sarah's voice. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a dull, rhythmic thudding that drowned out the sound of the rain beating against the windows. Every instinct in my body told me to turn around, to walk back out the door, to pretend I had never come home early. But my feet kept moving, drawn forward by a sickening, magnetic dread. I stepped past the pantry, rounding the corner that opened up into our bright, white subway-tiled kitchen. The scene froze into my memory with the agonizing clarity of a photograph. Sarah was leaning back against the granite kitchen island, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Her hair, usually kept in a neat clip while she worked, was messy and falling around her shoulders. Mark was standing directly in front of her, his hands resting firmly on her waist, his face buried in the crook of her neck. He was whispering something into her skin that made her shift closer to him, her eyes closed, a soft smile playing on her lips. They were so consumed by each other, so entirely lost in the bubble of their shared betrayal, that they didn't even hear me step into the room. The world seemed to lose all its color, shrinking down to the two people standing by the stove. The air left my lungs in a sharp, involuntary gasp. In that single second, the foundation of my entire reality crumbled into dust. The man I called my brother, the woman I had promised to love for the rest of my life, were rewriting the rules of my existence in the very room where we made breakfast every morning. I stood there paralyzed, my hands still halfway raised toward the refrigerator handle, watching the people I trusted most in the world completely destroy me. The sound that came out of my throat wasn't a shout, it was a low, choked gasp, like the sound someone makes when they've had the wind completely knocked out of them by a heavy blow. It was the only sound in the room, besides the steady, mocking rhythm of the rain hitting the window pane behind the sink. But to Sarah and Mark, it might as well have been a gunshot. They tore away from each other so fast it looked violent. Mark stumbled backward, his heel catching on the edge of the kitchen rug, his hands flying up instinctively as if he were trying to ward off a physical attack. His face went from a flush of heat to a sickly pale green in the span of a single heartbeat. Sarah's eyes snapped open, wide and wild with a terror so pure it didn't even look like her. She gripped the edge of the granite countertop so hard her knuckles turned entirely white, her chest heaving as she stared at me. For a long, agonizing 5 seconds, nobody breathed. Nobody spoke. The silence was thick, toxic, and absolute. I couldn't move. My work boots felt like they were cast in concrete, anchoring me to the hardwood floor, while my mind raced in 1,000 different directions, trying to find an alternative explanation for what I had just seen. Maybe he was comforting her. Maybe she had slipped and he caught her. Maybe I was having a vivid, stress-induced hallucination brought on by 70-hour work weeks and lack of sleep, but the guilt radiating off them was too loud to ignore. It was written in the disarray of Sarah's blouse, the way Mark wouldn't look me in the eye, and the heavy, electric smell of perfume and ozone in the air. Sarah was the first to break the silence. Her voice was thin, reedy, and entirely devoid of the confident tone she used every day. She took a step toward me, her hands reaching out, palms up, in a gesture that felt entirely transactional. She called my name, asking what I was doing home so early, her voice trembling over the words as if she could somehow talk her way out of the burning building we were suddenly trapped in. Hearing her say my name broke the paralysis. A wave of heat rushed from my stomach straight up into my chest, a primal, blinding rage that I had never experienced in my entire life. I looked at Mark, my best friend, the guy who had given the best man speech at my wedding, who had talked about loyalty, brotherhood, and the unbreakable bond we shared. He was standing near the refrigerator, his eyes darting toward the hallway as if he were calculating his escape route. I demanded to know what was happening, my voice coming out much louder and deeper than I intended, shaking the framed prints hanging on the kitchen wall. I didn't recognize my own voice. It sounded like a stranger's.
someone completely unhinged by grief.
Mark finally looked up, raising his hands higher, his voice shaking as he told me to calm down, calling me man like we were still just buddies arguing over a football game in a crowded bar. He said it wasn't what it looked like, that things had just gotten out of hand, that it was a mistake. The word mistake hit me like a physical slap. A mistake is forgetting to lock the back door or buying the wrong brand of milk. What I had just witnessed was an assassination of everything we had built. I took a step toward him, my fists clenching so hard my fingernails bit into my palms. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to destroy his face, to erase the smug, charming look he'd used his whole life to get away with everything. I wanted him to feel even a fraction of the sudden, suffocating agony that was ripping through my ribs. Sarah threw herself between us, her hands planting firmly on my chest. She begged me to stop, telling me not to do this, crying now, the tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and running down her flushed cheeks. She pleaded with me to talk to her, to look at her, to ignore him and just focus on her. Her touch felt like actual fire through my shirt, and I violently wrenched myself backward, away from her hands, away from the warmth I had spent 7 years seeking out every single night. I told her not to touch me, the words tasting like poison in my mouth.
I looked at both of them, standing in the kitchen I had paid for, surrounded by the lifestyle I had broken my back to provide, and I felt a profound, sickening sense of alienation. I didn't know these people. The woman standing before me in the rumpled clothes wasn't the girl I married in that little chapel in Fredericksburg. The man cowering by my pantry wasn't the friend who had held my flashlight while we changed a flat tire on the side of I-35 in the middle of a thunderstorm. They were strangers who had stolen the faces of the people I loved. I pointed a shaking finger at the front door and told Mark to get out. I didn't shout it this time. I whispered it, but the quietness of the command carried more weight than any scream could have. Mark looked at Sarah, a brief, silent communication passing between them that made my stomach turn all over again, and then he nodded quickly. He didn't even go down the hall to pack his bags. He grabbed his wallet and car keys from the counter, kept his head down, and practically sprinted past me, his shoulder brushing against the wall as he avoided getting within arm's reach of me. A moment later, the heavy oak front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house, followed by the roar of his car engine turning over, and the spray of gravel as he backed out of the driveway into the pouring rain. Then it was just the two of us. The silence returned, but this time it was louder, filled with the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing and the soft, rhythmic dripping of the faucet in the sink. She stood there, her shoulders slumped, looking incredibly small against the backdrop of our pristine kitchen. The wine glass on the counter seemed to mock me, a symbol of the casual, leisurely afternoon they had been enjoying while I was out sweating in the mud, trying to build a future for us. She started talking again, the words coming out in a desperate, chaotic torrent. She said it had only started a week ago. She said she was lonely, that I was never home anymore, that the house felt like a tomb with me gone 14 hours a day. She said Mark was just there, listening to her, paying attention to her in a way I hadn't in months. She tried to frame her betrayal as a consequence of my absence, a mathematical equation where my hard work equaled her loneliness, which somehow equaled her leaning against our kitchen island with my best friend's hands on her hips. I listened to her words, but they felt distant, like they were being transmitted from another planet. The justification was almost worse than the act itself. The realization that she had been sitting across from me at dinner, asking me how my day was, knowing that just a few hours prior she had been in the arms of the man sitting on our couch, made me feel physically ill.
The sheer calculation of it, the layers of deceit required to maintain that facade for even a single day, let alone a week or longer, was dizzying. I walked out of the kitchen, ignoring her as she followed me down the hallway, her bare feet patting softly on the wood. I went into our master bedroom, grabbed a duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet, and began throwing random clothes into it. Jeans, t-shirts, socks, whatever my hands touched first. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely zip the bag shut. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching me, her face pale, begging me not to leave.
asking where I was going to go. I didn't answer her. I couldn't. If I opened my mouth, I didn't know if I would scream, cry, or completely lose my mind. I threw the strap of the duffel bag over my shoulder, walked past her without making eye contact, and walked out into the cold, gray Texas rain, leaving the house and my marriage behind me in the dark. The rain didn't stop. It beat down on the roof of my truck with a relentless, deafening roar as I pulled out of the neighborhood and drove aimlessly into the gray Austin afternoon. I didn't have a destination. I just needed to put distance between myself and that kitchen, between myself and the ghost of the life I thought I was living. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my wrists ached, my eyes staring straight ahead at the blurred red taillights of the traffic on the interstate.
Every time I blinked, the image of them burning into each other against the granite countertop flashed behind my eyelids, vivid and agonizingly sharp. I ended up at a nondescript, mid-tier business hotel off the highway, the kind of place with beige carpets, a faint smell of industrial cleaner, and a view of a sprawling concrete parking lot. The check-in clerk gave me a polite, rehearsed smile, entirely unaware that the man standing in front of her with a muddy pair of work boots and a hastily packed duffel bag was completely hollowed out. I paid with a credit card, took the plastic key card, and walked up to the third floor in a daze. The room was suffocatingly quiet. I dropped my bag on the luggage rack and sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, staring at the blank television screen on the wall. The silence here was different from the silence in the house. It was empty, indifferent, and utterly lonely. For the first time since I walked into the kitchen, the shock began to wear off, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache in the center of my chest. The anger was still there, a low, smoldering ember, but the grief was washing over me in waves that felt heavy enough to drown me. My phone started vibrating in my pocket. It didn't just ring, it buzzed continuously, a frantic, desperate rhythm that didn't stop for hours. Sarah's name kept lighting up the screen. Then text messages started pouring in, a relentless stream of paragraphs pleading for me to answer, to come home, to just let her explain. Please talk to me. I'm so sorry. It didn't mean anything, I swear. Please don't throw us away. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words but feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of disgust. It didn't mean anything. The phrase was a joke. If it didn't mean anything, then why did it cost everything? Why did she trade 7 years of history, of shared dreams, of late-night conversations about our future, for a fleeting moment of cheap validation in our kitchen? The sheer casualness of the destruction was what broke me. They hadn't just made a mistake. They had systematically dismantled the sanctuary we had built, brick by brick, while I was out working to pay for the roof over their heads. Around midnight, a different name popped up on the screen. Mark. Seeing his name sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight to my heart. My thumb hovered over the screen, every muscle in my body tensing up. I pressed the phone to my ear, my breathing shallow, waiting to hear what the man I called my brother could possibly have to say for himself. His voice was thick, trembling, and entirely devoid of the smooth confidence he usually carried. He didn't offer a defense.
He just kept repeating how sorry he was, his voice cracking over the words as he told me he was disgusted with himself, that he had already packed the rest of his things from the house and left, that he was staying at a motel near the airport. He said he would do anything to fix it, that he didn't want to lose me as a friend, that he couldn't live with the guilt of what he'd done to me. I listened to him breathe on the other end of the line, the distance between us filled with an ocean of ruined trust. I thought about all the times I had backed him up, the times I had loaned him money, the doors I had opened for him when nobody else would give him the time of day. I thought about him sitting at my dinner table, drinking my beer, looking me in the eye and asking how the high-rise project was going, all while knowing what he was doing to my wife when the sun went down. I told him to never say my name again. I told him that if he ever came near me, near my work site, or near anyone I knew, I would show him exactly what a broken man was capable of. My voice was dead, flat, and cold, entirely devoid of the anger I had felt earlier. It was the finality in my tone that seemed to break him completely,
I could hear him sobbing on the other end as I pressed the red button and cut the connection, blocking his number before tossing the phone onto the nightstand. The next morning, the reality of the situation settled into my bones like a deep, unshakable chill.
I couldn't stay in that hotel forever, and I couldn't just abandon my job. I had a crew depending on me, a massive concrete pour scheduled for Thursday, and a reputation to maintain in an industry that didn't care about your personal tragedies. I forced myself to shower, put on a clean pair of jeans and a flannel shirt, and drove to the job site. Working was a surreal form of torture. I stood in the middle of the chaotic, loud construction zone, surrounded by the grinding of heavy machinery, the shouting of workers, and the smell of diesel and wet earth, but my mind was completely detached. I went through the motions, signed off on delivery manifests, checked blueprints, and answered questions from my superintendent, but I was operating on pure autopilot. Every time a worker asked me a question, I had to blink, focus my eyes on their face, and force my brain to process the words through the thick, heavy fog of my betrayal. When the workday finally ended, the dread of returning to the empty hotel room was too much to bear. Instead, I drove back to our neighborhood, pulling up to the curb a few houses down from my own. The house looked exactly the same as it had 48 hours ago. The grass was still green, the oak tree still swayed gently in the autumn breeze, and the lights in the living room were on, casting a warm, inviting glow onto the front lawn. From the outside, it looked like the perfect home, a picture of suburban peace.
But I knew that inside, the air was poisoned. I walked up the driveway, my chest tightening with every step. I didn't use my key this time. I knocked on the front door. I didn't want to surprise her again. I didn't think my heart could handle another shock. The door opened almost immediately, as if she had been standing right behind it, waiting for me. Sarah looked completely wrecked. Her eyes were red and swollen, her skin pale, and she was wearing an oversized sweatshirt of mine that she always used to wear when she was sick or stressed. The sight of her wearing my clothes, looking so fragile and broken, sent a sharp pang of familiarity through me, a cruel reminder of the woman I used to protect from everything. But she hadn't needed protection from the world. I had needed protection from her. She stepped aside to let me in, her eyes searching my face for any sign of softness, any hint that the storm had passed. I walked into the living room, refusing to go anywhere near the kitchen, and sat down on the armchair across from the couch where Mark had slept, the couch where they had probably sat together, whispering and laughing, while I was stuck in traffic on the interstate. The entire room felt contaminated, filled with the invisible residue of their deceit. Sarah sat on the very edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her shoulders hunched forward as if she were waiting for a blow. She didn't look like the confident, vibrant woman I had fallen in love with. She looked like a criminal waiting for a verdict, her breathing shallow and ragged in the quiet room. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in 7 years, I felt absolutely nothing but a profound, hollow exhaustion. The anger that had sustained me through the night in that dingy hotel room had burned itself out, leaving behind a cold gray ash that coated everything. She started talking again, her voice a low, desperate whisper that barely carried across the rug between us. She wasn't making excuses anymore. She was just laying herself bare, crying softly as she recounted how things had shifted. She told me she felt like she was fading into the background of my life, that the house had become a beautiful cage, and when Mark started paying attention to her, it felt like someone was finally turning the lights back on. I listened to her words, but they didn't hurt the way they had 48 hours ago. The betrayal was a done deal, a permanent fixture of our history now, as unchangeable as the foundation of the house we were sitting in. I asked her, my voice quiet and steady, if she loved him. She snapped her head up, her eyes wide with a frantic, terrified intensity as she shook her head violently. She said no, that it wasn't about love, that it was just a stupid, reckless escape from reality. She said she loved me, that she had always loved me, and that she would spend the rest of her life trying to fix the cracks she'd made. But some things are too broken to patch up with an apology and a promise. You can rebuild a wall after a storm, and you can pour new concrete over a cracked foundation.
but you can't unsee the image of your wife in the arms of the man you trusted like a brother. Every corner of the room, every piece of furniture we had picked out together at the market downtown felt heavy with the weight of what she had done. The trust wasn't just damaged, it was entirely gone, vaporized into nothingness the second I walked around that kitchen counter. I stood up from the chair, and the movement made her flinch, her eyes tracing my posture with an agonizing desperation. I told her I wasn't coming back. I told her we were going to sell the house, split the equity, and file for a dissolution of the marriage. She broke down completely then, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with heavy, shuddering sobs that echoed off the high ceilings. She begged me to go to counseling, to take a week, a month, a year to think about it, to not just walk away from everything we had built. I walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom to grab the rest of my things, her crying following me like a ghost through the quiet house.
I packed another suitcase, taking my time, neatly folding my shirts and packing my boots, operating with a cold, systematic precision. When I walked back into the living room, she was still on the couch, curled into a small ball, staring blankly at the floor. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't give her a final look. I just walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind me until I heard the heavy click of the latch. The Texas air was crisp and clear as I walked out to my truck, the rain finally gone, leaving the pavement dark and reflective under the streetlights. I got in, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb, watching the house disappear in my rearview mirror until it was just another dark shape in the suburban night. I knew the next few months were going to be a brutal uphill battle of legal paperwork, dividing up assets, and answering uncomfortable questions from family and friends who thought we were the perfect couple. I knew there would be nights where the loneliness would feel heavy enough to crush me. But as I turned onto the highway, accelerating into the open darkness ahead, I felt a strange, quiet sense of clarity. The life I thought I had was a lie, but the future ahead of me was entirely real, wide open, and completely mine to build from scratch. For the first time in a long time, I breathed in the cool night air, let go of the steering wheel just enough to relax my grip, and kept driving into the dark.